Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ryan Gapsky, and I'm the Speakers Director of the William F. Buckley Jr. Program at Yale. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to our firing line debate on common good conservatism. Before I introduce our guests, I'd like to say a few words about the Buckley Program. The William F. Buckley Program is an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We have hosted lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and an annual conference every year since 2011. Our over 400 Buckley Fellows have a wide range of political beliefs, but they all stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber on campus. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious conservative thought, the Buckley Program has become an institution on Yale's campus and a symbol for a more open and more representative political atmosphere. Especially at a university where the mission is the cultivation and creation of new knowledge, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and how to become a fellow on our website at buckleyprogram.com. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce our moderator and two speakers for today's debate. Dr. Gregory Collins, our moderator, is a lecturer in the Department of Political Science and program on ethics, politics, and economics. His book on Edmund Burke's economic thought, titled Commerce and Manners in Edmund Burke's Political Economy, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2020. Greg's scholarly and teaching interests include the history of political thought, the philosophical and ethical implications of political economy, American political development, constitutional theory and practice, and the political theory of abolition. Josh Hammer is opinion editor of Newsweek, a research fellow with the Edmund Burke Foundation, counsel and policy advisor for the Internet Accountability Project, a syndicated columnist through Creators, and a contributing editor for Anchoring Truths. A frequent pundit and essayist on political, legal, and cultural issues, Josh is a constitutional attorney by training and the co-host of two podcasts, Newsweek's The Debate and the Edmund Burke Foundation's NatCon Squad. An outspoken conservative, Josh opines on conservative intellectual trends, contemporary domestic and foreign policy debates, constitutional and legal issues, and the intersection of law, politics, and culture. He has been published by many leading outlets and has also had legal scholarship published by the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy and the University of St. Thomas Law Journal. Mr. Hammer will be debating in the affirmative for today's debate. Dan McLaughlin is a senior writer at National Review Online and a fellow at National Review Institute. He was formerly an attorney practicing securities and commercial litigation in New York City, a contributing editor for Red State, columnist at the Federalist and the New Ledger, and a baseball blogger at baseballcrank.com, bostonsportsguy.com, the Providence Journal Online, and a contributor to the Command Post. His writings on politics, baseball, and law have appeared in numerous other newspapers, magazines, websites, and legal journals. Mr. McLaughlin will be arguing in the negative for today's debate. Regarding the format of the debate, I'll turn it over to Professor Collins for some brief opening remarks, and then each of our guests will begin with 5-minute opening statements, after which they will both have 2 minutes each to respond. I'll turn it over to Professor Collins to moderate, and then he'll ask some of his own questions and take some from the audience. If you're interested in asking a question, please raise your hand and we'll get this mic over to you. And lastly, we'll conclude with 2 minutes of closing remarks from each speaker and wrap it up by 5:30 p.m. With that, please join me in welcoming our guests to Yale and to the Buckley Program.
Yes, you can see my bright smiling face. Welcome to today's debate. To cut to the chase, this debate on the meaning of conservatism, whether it is oriented towards a common good or not, in my judgment, has been probably the defining debate among conservative intellectual thought the past few years, 3, 4, 5 years. And it has challenged really many of the presuppositions of conservatism, in particular its libertarian and classical liberal strands that have emerged and were popularized by Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek and other classical liberal thinkers. And these two thinkers here have been at the forefront of this debate and have eloquently defended different forms of conservatism, common good conservatism and not. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing them articulate their thoughts on this defining debate that has characterized conservative intellectual discussion in the past 5 years or so. So with that, I'll open up to opening statements.
Okay, great. So look at the time, 4:38. Okay, so trying to keep a rough track of time here. So thank you guys so much for having me. Really my first time on Yale's campus, kind of surprisingly. I didn't grow up terribly far from here, but have not had an opportunity to be here before. It's obviously a beautiful campus. I went to Duke for undergrad, so I think we kind of sort of modeled our campus after y'all, so it's kind of cool to see the original version here. Great to be here with Dan. I think we overlapped a little bit blogging at Red State way back in the day when Eric Erickson was editing there, so it's kind of fun to reprise that here for y'all. So look, the terminology here, we can be a little fast and loose with it. The way we phrase it here today is common good conservatism. To me, I kind of use that term in my own line of work somewhat synonymously or interchangeably with national conservatism, which is the precise formulation I think most closely identifiable with the Edmund Burke Foundation, where I'm a research fellow, where Yoram Hazony is the chairman. What this basically gets down to is whether or not, from my perspective, a more kind of forward-facing, muscular, more robust form of conservative governance is needed. And my basic contention here is twofold, and I'll try to do this extremely quickly because our time here in opening remarks is obviously very limited. But my basic contention, we'll tease this out in Q&A, is that the modern quote-unquote conservative movement in America, to the extent that's really existed in kind of the post-war formulation, going back obviously to Gottman and Yale, from Buckley himself, and the founding of National Review, the Heritage Foundation, kind of the notion of the so-called fusionist consensus that Frank Meyer famously promulgated, this kind of fusing together of kind of economic laissez-faire with a privately held kind of social, moral, or cultural traditionalism. My contention is that this has failed at worst or simply been unsuccessful to deliver actually tangibly conservative results at best. And likewise, the natural corollary of that claim is that it has failed, at least in part, because it has not actually embraced conservatism, but because it has actually embraced a form of right-leaning liberalism, as the professor alluded to just now. So real quickly, I think anywhere you look around, it is pretty manifestly clear to me that the modern conservative movement has failed. You can basically take virtually any issue. Obviously, we're both lawyers. I mean, kind of, abortion, Roe versus Wade, obviously being a paradigmatic example here, of course. 50 years after Roe versus Wade, or 49 years to be precise. We'll see what the court does in the Dobbs versus Jackson women's health case that comes in June. Suffice to say, until now, that case obviously remains "quote unquote" good law at the U.S. Supreme Court. We have a wide open border where some of the most murderous transnational cartels in the world control large swaths of that border. There was fentanyl, there were drugs ruining in here. And all of these problems, you've kind of, I don't know how many of y'all are from the Midwest, or you've driven around the Midwest, or you've driven around to Ohio. I went to law school in Chicago. I've done the drive from New York to Chicago numerous times. I've actually stayed in Toledo, Ohio. I spent a good amount of time in Ohio, Indiana, places like that. You just have to drive around there. You literally just need to open your eyes to see what the neoliberal consensus has done in America. The notion, of course, to kind of quote a person from the George W. Bush White House, who famously said, potato chips, computer chips, what's the difference? What difference does it make? This notion that we are pursuing kind of economic GDP fetishization, economic efficiency as kind of an end unto itself, has torn asunder the American heartland. It has torn asunder America's very basic ability to maintain our supply chains, to maintain our economic integrity, and ultimately, of course, as we saw at the beginning of COVID with respect to kind of PPE, our very kind of economic and national security vitality. We have become utterly dependent on our foremost, our arch geopolitical rival, of course, the Communist Party of China, for our very kind of economic security. And they have done so because they have subscribed to an overly ideological, overly liberalized conception of conservatism that pursues the ruling class's globalist elites' ends at the expense of the American people themselves, whether it's crime, whether it's immigration, whether it's economics, and so forth here. And again, I think we have done so because we have mistaken what should have been kind of time, place, and manner policies, the likes of which kind of, ascended kind of President Reagan to office in 1980, the Reagan-Bush campaign in 84. We have mistaken policies, whether supply-side tax cutting, deregulation, things like that. We've mistaken policies for principles. Our conservative principles, to me, are effectively as follows. They are pursuing substantive justice, the notion that you render good to those who deserve good and harm to those who deserve harm, human flourishing, kind of the Aristotelian or classical formulation, and of course, ultimately getting at the common good of the whole, the common good where kind of nation, subsidiary states like actual states themselves, families, communities, and ultimately individuals are all operating in harmonious fashion in something that is greater than simple kind of individual preference aggregation. So I think we have totally just mistaken what are the ultimate goals of politics from a right-of-center perspective in kind of this overly liberalized format, and we have done so, I think, to a large extent by fetishizing GDP and things of that nature. So for the sake of time, I'll just cut off there. And
Well, it is good to be here. I feel that I'm actually rather at home getting to debate a defense of the American conservative tradition against a representative of the corporate mainstream media. The the word that you didn't hear in Josh's opening, and I think is really gets to so much of the crux of this debate, is liberty. You know, the American conservative tradition, a national conservatism, must consider what its nation is. And the classical liberal principles, the focus on liberty, are essential and have been essential from the very beginning to what is distinctively American. I mean, I think it is worth considering again the most famous sentence in American history. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, and that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and institute new government. You know, those words, we're still quoting them 246 years after they were written, because the idea of liberty is so powerful in America and so deeply embedded in American culture and also in American conservatism. You know, we actually, on the question of the relative role of liberty in the common good, and certainly the common good in some general sense, you know, the conservative traditional virtues of tradition, order, authority, are all parts of the American conservative tradition. But you know, we actually had kind of an experiment, if you will, a political science experiment here in the last 2 years in the United States, of what would happen if you had a crisis that required people on the one hand to consider, you know, both the utilitarian version of the greater good, but also the moral and virtue-based idea of the common good, of individuals being asked to sacrifice for the greater good. And that, of course, is the pandemic. Right? We were all asked to submit to all sorts of government authority in the name of the common good. And, you know, those are reasonable requests at a general level, and certainly many people considered them reasonable. But if you looked around at the American right over the past 2 years, broadly speaking, the center right, conservatives, libertarians, Republicans, independents, all of that, I think it is fairly safe to say that their instinctive response here was not, well, tread on me a little bit. What you saw instead was a great flourishing of, you know, the same sort of spirit that we saw, say, in the Tea Party movement 12 years ago, which is an instinctive desire for liberty, not only liberty of the individual, but also what it comes with in the conservative vision, which is liberty of the community, right? Liberty of the church, liberty of your businesses, liberty of the family. And so, you know, conservatism is not an atomized libertarian vision of just the individual, right? It recognizes the role of, you know, Burke's little platoons in society, but a fundamentally American version of conservatism sees that role of individual liberty with all of those things that are right there in that first sentence in the Declaration of Independence, right? The inalienable individual rights, the origin of those rights in our creation by God, the fact that those rights include individual liberty and the right to pursue your own vision of the good, and the idea that governments are democratic and based in the consent of the people because we trust the people, we trust, you know, the broadest distribution of power in society as the most effective safeguard of those individual rights. And, you know, I would say that one of the things that separates, I think, what I view as, you know, Reaganite conservatism, movement conservatism, Buckley conservatism, is a view of process as well, that process matters, rules matter, systems matter, and it's not just the substantive good. The substantive good is very important, but how we go about making decisions is enormously important. You know, we have a divide between, I mean, I'll wrap up a little bit here because I think we can get into some of this, but, you know, there's a fundamental divide between, say, conservatives and progressives, and I think that you know, this focus on kind of a guided vision of the collective, you know, a guided vision of the common good puts us a little bit away from the conservative position. The conservative position, as I see it, on our system is that, you know, the progressive vision is one of essentially supervised democracy, right? The idea that you get everybody in, everybody has their say, but then the people at the top of the system fundamentally decide which things are consistent with their principles and are allowed to happen and which are not, right? What words are allowed to be spoken and what are not. Whereas the conservative idea, the fusionist conservative movement idea is fundamentally that the process matters, and we have a deliberative process. We have a lot of speed bumps in the road before the people can finally be heard. But once they get over all of those, once they build a consensus, once they put rules in place, that those are the law, and those are, at the end point of the deliberations of the people, that is the vision of the common good that governs the country. I mean, I guess what I would ask Josh is who decides what the common good is?
2-minute rebuttal.
All right. So a lot to unpack there, obviously. I'm sure we'll get into more of this in Q&A. So look, I think my side, broadly speaking, of this debate, the so-called new right, which, by the way, is a term I don't particularly like. I actually was watching, of all things, a documentary. I don't know if y'all seen Get Me Roger Stone on Netflix, a documentary about Roger Stone. Way back when Stone became president of college Republicans or young Republicans back in the 70s, they were called the New Right. So, these terms always change, they mean nothing. But my side of this broader debate, what we now call the so-called New Right, I think we understand that liberty is a good. What we object to is the notion that liberty should be, or at least historically has been over the past 60, 70 years, I think exalted, placed on a pedestal as the sole and unambiguous good that defines who we are as Americans and who we are as conservatives in particular. That's not conservatism as I recognize it. That is libertarianism at best. It is an overly liberalized version of conservatism. What I subscribe to is a very basic notion. I mean, how Russell Kirk would have formulated, of course, is order to liberty. And my basic contention is that if you look at kind of the intellectual and historical genealogy of the post-fusionist, post-Frank Meyer consensus over the past 60, 70 years, we have erred way, way, way too much on the side of liberty. But the time now, when you look what's actually happening in America with family breakdown, with skyrocketing out of wedlock childbirths, obviously, with record-breaking opioid over deaths, with a ruling class that is so completely untethered from the interests of the common man, I think it is time to basically affirmatively legislate on behalf of the common good. And what that means is that legislators, administrators in Article 2, and yes, judges in Article 3, that's a separate side debate, should, in their day-to-day functions, pursue their constitutional actions within their own kind of independent constitutional spheres of influence with a mind to the common weal, with an eye towards solidarity, cohesion, ultimately, of course, national unity, and at the expense of idiosyncratic notions of individual autonomy. Now, look, on the COVID thing in particular, look, I flew up here today. Obviously, a judge did a very brave and heroic thing, and yesterday, kudos to her. It was wonderful to kind of breathe without this stupid freaking face diaper on. I love that. But it is possible to arrive at that conclusion, as myself, my friends like Sohrab Ahmari, and many others have done, on fundamentally common good-oriented paradigms. It's possible, of course, to arrive at the opposite conclusion, too. The common good is simply a framework for analysis. It's an analytical framework. It does not decisively answer every single minutia of policy detail here. But the point here is that if COVID had been a massively fatal disease, we're talking about like a 15-20% fatality rate if you catch this thing, and it's spreading like wildfire, then that's a pretty freaking strong empirical case that the common good is best preserved by very draconian lockdowns, mandates, whatever. That was not the case. COVID obviously was less lethal in many respects, according to some data I've seen, than the common flu. Certainly, I saw data from the Bank of England suggesting that was the case back in England. The COVID vaccines are kind of infamously not, inefficacious. They're not effective at all. So it ultimately gets down to an empirical question, to say nothing, obviously, of how the ruling class and the regime has manipulated the COVID regime, from lockdowns, mandates, and masks and all of that, to basically err on the side of the Davos laptop class that can work from home and they get along well, and the small business owners, well, they're crap out of luck. So there's very much kind of an element of class warfare going on in COVID as well. So I kind of arrive at all those conclusions through kind of a common good analytical lens, not through kind of a necessarily kind of, don't tread on me, kind of, get off my lawn Clint Eastwood lens.
2 minutes.
The other thing that I would add to this debate here is I think that conservatism, part of conservatism requires us to think historically, right? We have to think about how things have developed over time, how our institutions, how our ideas have developed over time. I would make 2 points about that. One here is that, first of all, when we talk about the American founding, and the durability of its ideas. I think if you look at the founding of the Republican Party in that era, right, what some historians even would call our second founding, I think the ideas of liberty, of the dignity of free labor, of a kind of Lockean property rights concept was very much central to why Lincoln and his generation came up with their vision, which I think is still very vital and important today to the conservative movement. But I would dispute Josh's view that that kind of the conservative movement of Reagan and Buckley was somehow a terrible failure for the country. I think as conservatives we have to be realistic, first of all, about the fact that not every problem is going to be solved all at once. You're always going to set out to solve more things than you were able to solve. And also that victories won today are not always won forever. Every victory needs to be re-won in every generation. But I think if you look back at the record, if you look back at where the country stood from the 50s through the 70s, politically we have come a very, very long way. Now part of that is a matter of partisan politics, and obviously partisan politics is only part of the story because partisan politics gets you power, and then you still have to ask what you did with power. But fundamentally partisan politics is important because it rests on persuasion of the voters. And the New Deal era, basically from the 30s through the 70s, there was an enormous top-to-bottom Democratic control of state legislatures, of Congress. All of that fell away. The Democrats ran Congress for 40 years. When Ronald Reagan ran for president, the electorate voter registration was something like 15 points more Democratic than Republican. So you had a shift in that. Secondly, I think, if you look at one of I think Josh's complaints about elites is this kind of march through the institutions of the progressives, but there is no area in which conservatives have been more successful in marching through the institutions than in the courts and in the legal academy. If you look at the Federalist Society, if you look at the Originalist movement, look, we will have a test of Roe versus Wade very soon, but it is worth considering that even in the mid-1980s there were two justices on the court who were against Roe. Even as recently as, and politics matters, even as recently as Planned Parenthood versus Casey in 1992, which upheld Roe, 7 of the 9 justices on the Supreme Court had been confirmed by a Democratic Senate. And so the building of a political body that was more than just the head in the White House has been enormously important. I think if you look at where we stand in the Second Amendment, for example, the right of gun ownership is enormously far advanced today from where it was in the 1970s. Street crime is back. That is a classic example of a battle that needs to be won more than once. But the dramatic changes in the 1990s after decades of urban decay, the media landscape, up until the end of the Fairness Doctrine in 1987, it was practically impossible to find conservative media of the sort that are all over the place today. And that's even besides when we consider the Cold War and the massive changes, the end of enormous progressive tax rates. So I think when you look back at what the conservative movement as such accomplished over that period of time, I think it was actually wildly successful. It was not successful at doing everything. And it did not leave everything, it left things to be done by the next generation. But I think it was an enormously successful movement. And look, as conservatives, principles are a compass, not a straitjacket, right? They guide us forward. So of course we need to reevaluate our strategies, our particular issue orientation from each generation to the next. But I do not think that we need to sort of throw out our guiding principles and our guiding framework. And I certainly do not think that it is productive for us to look at economic liberty, at free markets, and think that the exigencies of today demand a heavier hand from government you know, in rejecting those kinds of liberties, because frankly, you know, what we've seen over and over again is that when, you know, we invite government in to do that, it never leaves.
I thank you for those powerful comments and remarks. Allow me to pose a few questions that I have based on your comments here today, your previous work, and then we'll open to the audience. I read nothing into these. I'm a moderator. I'm a neutral arbiter in my position right now. Josh, forgive me if I'm wrong, but I don't know if you answered Dan's question about who defines common good conservatism. Literally speaking, is it legislators in Congress? Is it judges? Judges seem to be one aspect of that answer based on your writings. If so, then how can you reconcile that with a populist strand in national conservatism? Should be populists themselves who define the common good. You've done some scholarly work on how we understand that phrase, the common good, during the founding era. That seems to lean on the ideas of the founding fathers, going through the convention debates and so on. So precisely, who is defining the common good? That's my first question. Second question, in terms of the common good, progressives, of course, also have a vision of a common good, right? And in fact, correct me if I'm wrong, a progressive liberal, dare I say Marxist critique of neoliberalism, free market capitalism, Milton Friedmanite and Hayekian thinking, does not overlap to some extent with what you're suggesting. If so, then I guess the implications are politically, can a common good conservative align themselves with some of the interests of the progressive left? Or qualitatively, are there some distinctions that should remain separate between a progressive conception of the common good and a national conservative conception of the common good? Final point for you, to what extent do the social pathologies that you appropriately outlined, are they extent of too much economic liberty, as we say today, or not enough economic liberty? So to put my libertarian, classical liberal, Milton Friedman, Hayekian cap on, well, social pathologies, unemployment, breakdown of the family, do they not impact, or were they not impacted in some way by excessive regulations, excessive overly generous unemployment benefits, social insurance programs, and so on, the arguments that we're familiar with? In that sense, is not market capitalism not a cause of, but actually it's a possible remedy to mitigate some of the social pathologies that you mentioned? For Dan, oh, I'm sorry, yeah, go ahead, yeah. I have questions for you, but yeah.
Okay, I'll try to remember all that. It's a lot to take in, obviously. Okay, so to your first question, who defines the common good? I think that's somewhat of a straw man, with all due respect. I think that's in no point do I think that anyone has to singularly kind of come down and kind of Moses from Sinai with the tablets fashion and say, this is the common good. I mean, obviously, you know, on that point, though, I mean, everyone who has their own kind of their own individual religious faith or kind of ethical tradition will have his or her own conception of the common good. My claim is merely that every constitutional actor in our government, and here, obviously, in America, we have both national and state level actors, we have kind of Article 1, Article 2, Article 3, congressional, executive branch, and judicial actors. They all within their well delineated kind of separation of powers, checks and balances, kind of curtailed spheres of constitutional action should be pursuing their individual roles with an eye to the common good. So a lawyer for a United States senator should be advancing legislation, you know, both from a policymaking and kind of an analytical perspective of Congress's Article 1, Section 8 enumerated powers, with an eye to the common good, with an eye to what the preamble of the Constitution would refer to as kind of the general welfare, the common defense, a more perfect union, things like that. In Article 2, administrators should also, to the extent possible, be doing their kind of day-to-day kind of bureaucratic work with an eye to the common good. And yes, judges should be kind of interpreting the Constitution from an originalist perspective, but ultimately through an analytical prism of the common good, which I root primarily in the preamble of the Constitution. So it's not that one person has to define it. It's that every actor must necessarily be acting towards that end through their individual spheres of influence. The second question, which is kind of the populist question, you know, look, my good friend Roger Kimball had a great essay on Buckley and populism literally 2 days ago, actually, at American Greatness, so this question is quite timely. You know, look, I mean, I think, you know, Buckley obviously being, first of all, kind of the eponymous name of this program, but obviously also kind of like the founder of the modern conservative movement in many ways, if you will. You know, look, I don't think that he would have abhorred kind of a lot of this modern populist sentiment. I mean, one of his most famous quips, obviously, as Roger aptly points out in his American Greatness essay, is, of course, kind of his famous bon mot that he said up in Harvard about kind of how he would rather be governed by the first 2,000 names in the Boston, Massachusetts phone book than the 2,000 members in the Harvard faculty lounge. That is a very, very, very populist sentiment. You know, I think kind of some level of populism, some level of kind of skepticism or even kind of outright hostility to elites is very much ingrained in the DNA. You know, Dan has properly signed the Declaration of Independence, which I also love. I'm born on Abraham Lincoln's birthday. No one worshipped the Declaration more than Abraham Lincoln. But if you kind of go back to that sentiment, well, they were deeply populist insofar as they were trying to kind of rally the masses against authority, against King George III. So I think some level of populism has kind of always been there, especially in modern American conservatism. And what is God and Man at Yale, if not kind of a populist, anti-elitist manifesto? I think it is absolutely that. And when I'm kind of saying that people should be pursuing the common good within their spheres of influence, what I'm saying is that they should do so in a way that is ultimately getting at kind of the health of the whole in kind of a solidaristic fashion. And I think kind of that interpretive prism necessarily will disproportionately redound to the interests of kind of lower middle class folks more than an emphasis on kind of limousine, Upper West Side, New York Times reading liberalism. I think kind of the left-right liberal consensus, if you kind of look at it, kind of this neoliberal consensus of economic liberalization coupled with cultural deregulation, it's worked out extremely well for the upper rungs of society, for the Davos class, the class that is posting on Facebook with their masks saying, you know, do all of our part to stop the spread. They get to work from home. The lawyers, bankers, the journos, I get to work from home, okay? It's nice to be kind of in the upper rungs of society. It's not so nice for the people that have to actually go in to work, who got out of jobs from kind of this performative virtue signaling. So I think kind of a common good lens necessarily does disproportionately redound on the side of kind of the more populist sentiment. So I think those two things kind of work in harmonious fashion. To your third question, if I remember correctly, the one about social pathologies. So look, you know, Charles Murray had this great book, Coming Apart, with kind of a really kind of detailed look at kind of the unraveling of places like Pennsylvania, Ohio, folks. And then he kind of ultimately concludes towards the end of his essay that, you know, it's basically kind of just their fault. I mean, they kind of need to like culturally better themselves. J.D. Vance, in Hillbilly Elegy does something somewhat similar, although he, I think, properly has had a bit of a change of heart since then. He kind of now talks about kind of political economy a bit more than he did when he wrote that book. You know, look, certainly some of that is true, obviously. I mean, like, obviously a lot of this is kind of a cultural issue, but there is absolutely, I think, more the government can and should be doing. You know, look, I was in Budapest, Hungary 2 months ago. I spent time with Prime Minister Orban. I am one of those guys you hear about who was looking to places like Hungary and Prime Minister Orban in terms of what they're doing for family policy. They have been able to directly incentivize child rearing. They have raised their total fertility rate, not astronomically, but they have been able to raise it. I think the government should be getting involved in things like that to actually more directly legislate on behalf of working moms and pops, on behalf of families, and things of that nature there. And there definitely is a role for political economy to play here. It's not exclusively kind of a cultural phenomenon. And more fundamentally, again, if we're kind of getting to the question of what it means to be a conservative, you know, a lot of kind of the trends in political economy, I think, did kind of undermine the working man. So one good example here is private sector unionization. There's no obvious reason to me that conservatives should be so manifestly opposed, in theory, to private sector unions. Obviously, kind of in the pragmatic reality we live in, you know, the AFL, you know, all the major unions are total Democratic donors who hate our guts and probably want us in gulag. So I'm not suggesting that we should go and support them. But in theory, on kind of like a political theory and economic theory chalkboard, you can literally go back to the writings of Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill. I mean, paradigmatic classical liberals. They saw nothing wrong whatsoever with the idea of kind of collective bargaining for private sector workers. Public sector, obviously, totally different ballgame. Not going to get into that. But yeah, I do think that there is a role for political economy to play here, for sure.
So Dan, you eloquently quoted the first 2 paragraphs, I believe, of the Declaration. But of course, the document does not end there, right? And most of the document is actually a practical listing of the specific grievances the Americans faced by particularly the British Parliament, not even King George, but the British Parliament itself. And we're familiar with this from our high school history classes. If you interpret that entire document, the Declaration, then, to what extent then should we lean on liberty as a guiding lodestar, as opposed to a more historically informed, conscious adoption of those pre-American roots of our American heritage, which certainly embraced elements of commercial liberty, but also these more historical elements I think that Josh is suggesting should be elevated when we understand a proper conception of conservatism. And in terms of process, right, process of course is important. Then can you specifically address, this is probably the key criticism of this process proceduralist argument, which I think sometimes is unfairly cast, right, for those critics of national common good conservatism. But does process, I think you've written about this before, but enlighten us, does process and procedure ultimately is it not neutral, but does trend toward progressive beliefs, presuppositions, sort of Amari's drag queen famous anecdote? Is that argument persuasive, or does the seemingly procedural neutral method tend to favor both perspectives, one more than the other?
Yeah, I mean, it's good questions. I mean, I think there's a couple things to unpack here. Again, you know, the Declaration, first of all, of course, is a legal matter. The Declaration does one and only one thing, which is that it declares the United States an independent sovereign nation. The rest of it is all just argument. But even then, if you look at those arguments, I think a good deal of the arguments that are made in the Declaration, the grievances with the Crown, some of those are about representation, but many of them are about invasions of individual rights. You know, particularly abuses of essentially the criminal process against the colonists. So I think that, you know, that there is more to it there, but, you know, the Declaration as an idea, I think that first sentence is the part of it that carries particular weight in our politics. And again, I think we need to think about, you know, what is the language of American politics? I think that language is one in which liberty and the Declaration have played a continually important role, and one that still resonates today. And whereas I think that the concept of the common good is maybe at such a high level of generality that it doesn't always, you know, I'm not sure it really means very much to the ordinary citizen when you phrase it simply as, well, the common good, which is what? It's good and it's common. You know, and as to the question of process, and I think that relates to the question of who decides these things. I mean, I think Josh kind of waves away the idea that you know, that we should focus on, you know, all the actors in the system should be pursuing a vision of the common good, which doesn't really answer what the common good is. But, you know, I think process rules about who decides things really are, I mean, process rules are not neutral in the sense that who decides matters a lot to how things get decided, right? And so all of the different parts of our conservative idea of process, our American idea of process, are oriented towards striking a balance between elites and populists, striking a balance that works in favor of liberty by you know, it works in favor of the commonness of the vision of the common good by involving the greatest number of people in the making of decisions, but also sort of, you know, making the government move more slowly. I mean, I think that you know, if you look at each of the pieces work together, right? I mean, we have democracy, which involves the largest number of people in the making of decisions. We have tradition, which brings in not only the people alive, but the trial and error of people in the past. We have written law, right? So that we don't simply have, we were the first nation in history that gave the government a rule book it had to follow, not only protection of individual rights, but the distribution of powers. We don't simply have a purely common law system of justice in which judges decide what is the good. They are bound by the written rules. We have free markets, and free markets are simply, you know, the democracy of economics, essentially. The decisions of the greatest number of people in their purchasing decisions, in how they allocate capital, in how they allocate labor, and even the free movement of people within the country. All of that is the distribution of decision-making power to the largest number of people, so that you get a vision of the good that is arrived at collectively, and power is distributed enough locally that people in different areas who have different ideas can pursue those. I mean, I don't think that our process, I don't think our system should be neutral as to, you know, between truth and falsehood, between right and wrong, but I think it has to have enough play in the joints that we not only bring the largest number of people into deciding what the good is, but we also give space for people to live, a different kinds of pursuits of happiness. And look, I mean, I think the example of Orban's Hungary, I think it is admirable that Orban is trying to promote, the growth of families. I don't know that he's been terribly successful at that, actually, compared to some of his neighbors. But, the biggest thing that has held the Hungarian state back is a lack of economic liberty, that the economy there simply isn't, is not as strong as ours. And again, I mean, if you look at unions, the question of unions, unionization as a voluntary choice is perfectly fine in the private sector, although I think it is a little strange to talk about unions in theory as separate from the unions that actually exist in the elites, the union elites who actually run them. I don't think that's really any different from talking about our universities or our newspapers, or our social media companies, totally in isolation from who actually runs them. So, it seems to me at all of these levels, we distribute power in order to promote liberty, but also to promote the largest number of people having an input into what the common good is.
Thank you guys both for the debate. It was very interesting. Of course, a very important topic for conservatives today. This question is more for the gentleman on the affirmative. I may be misunderstanding, but it seems under the gentleman's framework that President FDR may be the best president ever. Is this false? If so, where am I misunderstanding?
So I realize that you think this is probably a pretty cute gotcha question, right? So FDR pursued his own vision of the common good according to his own pre-existing analytical frameworks. He was very successful at doing so. I would argue that the best president ever is Abraham Lincoln, who pursued his vision of the common good in kind of a more kind of unified, solidaristic notion, and who, by the way, erred on the side of substantive justice and substantive truth over and over and over again, over kind of an overly rigid proceduralist form of liberalism, as encapsulated by his speech after the Dred Scott decision, his first inaugural address, where he famously said that he would not enforce the Dred Scott decision as it pertains to any party other than to Mr. Scott himself, because it was an egregious act. He kind of shepherded through in 1862, Congress passing through the issuing passports to slaves in the Western territories in direct contravention of Dred Scott. So he was pursuing a substantively correct vision of the common good, which of course is rooted, as Dan would be the first to tell you, in the equality statement in the Declaration. I would source that, by the way, most foundationally in Genesis 1:27. I mean, it's nice the Declaration says it, but we kind of already knew that that was true. Yeah, look, I think FDR was very successful pursuing his vision of the common good, but his substantive vision of the common good is certainly not mine. I think that he was procedurally effective at doing so in very kind of rigid fashion. But it was a nice, cute gotcha question.
I was going to follow that up somewhat with the gentleman in the affirmative agreed that there's like an objective sort of vision of the common good, and he talked about in his speech about how each sort of politician and judges in their own sphere should be deciding the common good. How do we sort of rectify what feels, at least to me, if I'm understanding right, like a paradox? How is there supposed to be both an objective good and we're kind of just okay with everyone pursuing their own version of it?
What is the alternative?
Isn't this the other?
The alternative is like the strongest form version of a values-neutral liberalism, which my interlocutor has even conceded is a lie.
Yeah.
Right. So that doesn't exist. Like that literally does not exist. Maybe in some political science class that someone took in middle school or high school, they have told you that a true values-neutral public square, a true values-neutral economy, a true values-neutral constitutional order, a true values-neutral Hollywood, big tech, Wall Street, corporate, Fortune 500. BS. It's a lie. And this is the fundamental, this is literally, I think, the dividing line of this debate, okay? The point is that, quote unquote, American conservatives for the past 67 years have been fighting repeatedly with one hand tied behind their back because of this overly liberalized notion of what it means to actually suggest an affirmative vision of what they actually believe in the public square. They have at best at best, I think, fought to a draw on some contested issues. We have successfully, for now, fought to a draw on religious liberty. Religious liberty jurisprudence on the Supreme Court is not in a terrible place. It is not in a great place, but it is definitely not in a terrible place. That is probably the best that we can do. But over and over and over again, we have completely vanquished, or we have abandoned, I should say, the very notion of firmly putting our values in the public square. What has that resulted in? It has resulted, of course, in this Gramscian march through the institutions, which we see over and over and over again. My friend Chris Rufo is doing yeoman's work on a daily basis to expose the moral and ethical rot that is happening in classrooms and boardrooms all across America. And that has happened, not unilaterally, but at least due in large part to the fact that half the country has been told repeatedly that they can't so much as put a thumb on the scale as far as their vision of the good. The left comes in with their dystopian vision of the good, and they're very good at it, obviously. So I kind of forgot your question, honestly, but I can just end that there.
This is a question for Dan. So, and the interesting thing about the American founding is there were some people that were way more moralizing than others when it started. Like we have the Puritan tradition, and then we have the Southern tradition. Very different people. How do you think that you determine which one we're drawing from more today? And it seems that at certain points in history, we may have drawn from others in varying degrees. And is there one that we should be oriented towards more? Should we be oriented more towards like this public square where everyone is holding each other morally accountable? Or should we be heading more in a direction, not necessarily of like the slaveocracy, but one where we are taking in as many different and being tolerant of as many different dissenting perspectives as possible?
I mean, I think, first of all, you get to an important point about the founding, which is that the founders didn't all agree with each other either. So we've been having these arguments about what exactly the good is, what exactly the right is, all the way since the beginning. I do think that the difficulty of getting people into agreement is why we have to have a certain amount of kind of neutral values arguments, not only for the rule of law, right? John Adams in the Massachusetts Constitution talking about, that we be a government of laws, not of men, and that means a single rule of law for everyone. But I think even on cultural things, I think we do have to promote, a space for tolerance and disagreement. And I think that the promotion of the common good, of any vision of the common good, a vision of the moral good certainly is something that conservatives should be promoting, but I think that it always has to be balanced with that sense of pluralism that we have in the society, and and I think I think if you look at the stuff that, Josh references a lot of what Chris Rufo is doing in public education and stuff, a lot of that is because it is finally making a difference, in part because the work is being done to expose it, but in part because people have moved from a situation where they felt that, that there was one vision being promoted that maybe they didn't totally agree with, to a sense that their own rights and liberties were being trampled upon, right? That a climate of intolerance was building. And so I think I think the overreach that you get from intolerance that attacks any pretense of neutrality, I think that's something where conservatives have an opportunity to fight back. And I think that the opportunity to fight back and present even our own moral vision does depend in part on being able to appeal to these ideas of liberty and neutrality in some extent, to say, look, the other guy is he's crossing those lines. Part of the reason FDR's opponents were unsuccessful is that I think they were not able to make the case effectively as they should have been, that there were lines that shouldn't be crossed. And when they were successful at fighting him at some turns, in like the court packing fight, it was because of those neutral lines. It wasn't because the Senate Democrats and the Democratic-run newspapers decided that FDR wanted bad things from the Supreme Court. They liked the stuff that he wanted from the Supreme Court, but they recognized that there were certain neutral principles of governance that he had violated, that he had trampled on.
Thank you. My question is mostly for the gentleman in the negative. You seem rather content to allow for perhaps the free market to provide the majority of the solutions in place of bureaucrats, judges, political representatives. But how does one necessarily regulate against market externalities in terms of output of culture, right? If conservatism is the ultimate form of moral good and will provide for the existence of liberty, how does one answer that the largest sort of giants in corporate media, entertainment, banking, etc., are all necessarily progressive or leftist giants? How does one necessarily work against that?
I mean, look, I think the battle is ultimately joined in trying to provide alternatives. I mean, I think a lot of these fights are about the fact that that some of these large corporations are not listening to their own customers. They're not listening to sometimes to their own shareholders, and so I think there are fights that can be had. On the grounds that they're fundamentally failing. And look, what would be one example of how do you fight this sort of thing? I mean, I think Elon Musk's effort to take over Twitter is a perfect example of using, now he may succeed and he may fail, but it is certainly an example of bringing, the forces of capitalism to the table to say, wait a minute, you are not delivering the value for your customers or your shareholders that you could be and should be, and so you should lose your position, and the market can decide that. Now, that is not, corporate takeovers are obviously a perfect example of an area that is not regulated only by the pure laissez-faire free market, right? I mean, there's an extensive securities regulation, there's extensive state corporate law overlay there, but I think the cultural battles do need to be fought, and I think that but very often behind what appears to be market power is often the government with its thumb on the scales. I mean, if you look at woke capital, right, the banks. I mean, who are the biggest shareholders in that, right? It's the state pension funds. It's, you've got the SEC leaning on them. There are a lot of governmental forces that are at work that are bending things in that direction. And I think that using government power, not to bend it back in the other direction, but to remove that force, is something that is very much within traditional free market conservative theory.
Thanks. This is great. Thanks. This question is also for Josh. So you started off talking about abortion, the border wall, free trade, but I was wondering, wouldn't you have to say that like the open society, the free trade, all that's what's made us all incredibly rich. Even the poor on a global scale are quite wealthy. And also, just trying to understand common good conservatism. What's a proxy issue that you would say is like, if you believe in this, you're probably common good conservative?
No, I mean the second is like an interesting question. I'll take that first. I mean, look, if you reject the lie of pure values neutrality in education and pedagogy, things like that, and then you should want to affirmatively use state power to just outright ban critical race theory and all of its all of its various manifestations, right? So there was kind of that 4 byline New York Times op-ed last summer. I think a Yale professor was one of the 4 who wrote it. David French was another, and so forth. They basically said, like, because we defend liberalism or whatever, like, we're not going to ban this. I mean, if you disagree with that, and you think that there is absolutely a legitimate role to outright ban toxic, civilizational arson from the classrooms, then you're probably closer to my side of the debate. Lots of other kind of, if you think that it's kind of use kind of one of the examples that got this entire debate started, 3 years ago. If you think that the government can outright ban drag queen story hour from public libraries because it is not kind of an unqualified free speech issue right there, you're probably closer to my side. Things like that. I almost forgot your first question though. Can you just remind me real quick what it was?
Sorry, just that free trade,
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, look. So look, I think there's been a misconception here, perhaps, based on perhaps this question that I'm like here as like a Marxist or something. Look, I majored in economics in college. Okay, I've seen what neoclassical economics looks like on chalkboard. I worked in antitrust research before law school. I went to University of Chicago for law school because of its law and economics curriculum back in the day. I am very much a capitalist, but I'm a qualified capitalist. As Irving Kristol would have said, I'm a two cheers for capitalism kind of capitalist, because I recognize that capitalism, free markets, has been extremely successful and is fundamentally better than its chief and preeminent rival, of course, which is socialism. But at the same time, unqualified three cheers for capitalism, style capitalism, pursued as an end unto itself, where you are simply and singularly pursuing kind of GDP maximization, you are pursuing kind of efficiency in supply chains, trade, all of that as ends unto itself, you are going to corrode communities. You are going to corrode families. People are going to be displaced. Jobs are going to be ruined. Jobs are going to be outsourced. In the case of supply chains in China, we have literally given China the very rope to hang ourselves as it pertains to kind of supply chains. And the American founders, many of them were very prescient about this. Go back and read kind of Alexander Hamilton's 1791 opinion on, or his report on manufacturers. He basically saw all of this coming, and a lot of them did. So Ecclesiastes says there's nothing new under the sun, and that's really kind of all my side of the debate is trying to recover kind of this older kind of more Hamiltonian vision of American political economy. But I'm very much a capitalist, but like Irving Kristol, like two cheers for capitalism style capitalist.
All right, thank you for those questions. Now we'll go to closing statements, 2 minutes for each. We'll start with Josh, and please do try to keep it 2 minutes. Rhonda.
Yeah. Okay, so look, I think we've said most of what can or should be said here. I guess my basic argument, and what I really think this boils down to, is not what I was just talking about here, but the last time I talked before that, I guess, which was my basic contention is that the post-war conservative movement has fundamentally tied one hand behind its back, whether it's in terms of political economy, whether it's in kind of the cultural, social sphere, whether it, of course, is in the sphere of constitutional interpretation and jurisprudence more generally. And we have done so because we have fetishized procedure, process, and kind of this pristine kind of ivory tower goal that does not exist in the real world of kind of a values-neutral liberalism. We have kind of entrusted that as kind of the lodestar for all that we believe in. But in so doing, the left has not played nice. They have not followed by the rules, and of course they haven't, because they never would have. It was kind of a ridiculous notion in the first place. But I do think that you kind of trace this back to kind of the original kind of fusionist consensus that kind of got all this kind of National Review, Heritage kind of style Buckley, Reagan liberalism, or right liberalism kind of conservatism started. Meyer himself, Frank Meyer, famously said that, when he wrote his book or his treatise about fusionism, the social cultural components that he was getting at was to be private within the home. It was kind of this notion that in kind of the Enlightenment marketplace of ideas that our cultures and values would prevail over time. But the idea here was that there was no kind of proper public-facing role for values injection. And in that sense, it was kind of fundamentally liberal. And I think that's really kind of done drastic harm. From my perspective, it is no accident that, after the Engel versus Vitale Supreme Court case in the 1960s, which removed the Bibles from the classroom, now only kind of 60 years later, we can't even tell you how many genders there are. It's right there in Genesis 1:27, by the way. There's two of them. To me, these are no accidents. And we have done so, again, by kind of fetishizing kind of this values neutrality and just entrusting that kind of, the moral arc of history will bend towards our values. It's nonsense, and whether I think it's political economy, constitutional interpretation, or anything else in the public square, it is wholly appropriate, just, it is directly responsive to the magnitude of the morass that we're in right now to act with a thumb on the scale towards our eternal values.
I'll start with a point of privilege here on Josh's answer to the last question about about whether or not we can ban untrue ideas from the classroom, and I think the answer is that and I'll tie this in a second, that when a public school teacher stands up in front of an elementary school classroom or a high school classroom, that is an agent of the state, a paid agent of the state on government property, proposing an orthodoxy to children, to a captive audience of children. I don't think there's any need for us to pretend. I don't think that value neutrality of any kind requires us to pretend that we have nothing to say for that. That is exactly the sort of thing that the democratic process should supervise. And in fact, I think a lot of the problem with public education is a lack of proper democratic supervision. But that gets us back to the question of who decides things. Rules and order, rules and liberty go together because ultimately, you know, as conservatives, we are the people who believe in rules. We do, and we are able to promote our vision of society in large part by showing that we are the people who recognize pluralism, who recognize the value of rules, and who recognize the importance of democratic input into the making of decisions. So, you know, this is not an idea that there's a pie in the sky, perfect neutrality, or, you know, a frictionless universe. It is a recognition that, you know, that individual liberty matters, that rules and order matter, including their ability to be neutral and fair to everyone in society. And, you know, it's not fighting with one hand behind your back to be the grown-ups in the room, to be the people who recognize that law matters, that how we make decisions matter, and that liberty, economic liberty matters every bit as much as, you know, as other kinds of liberty, because that is what gives you the power as an individual to do your own thing with your own family.
And with that, we'll close today's debate. Thank you, Professor Collins, Mr. Hammer, Mr. McLaughlin, for joining us, and a special thanks to Professor Ballas for serving as our faculty sponsor. Thank you, everyone.